The rain struck the glass windows of Lou's late-night diner like tiny, furious fists, relentless and insistent, as if trying to break inside to unload its own storm. I wiped the same spot on the counter for the third time, my reflection faint and distorted in the glossy surface. 3 more hours until my shift ended. 3 more hours until I could stretch out on my worn-out sofa, close my eyes, and momentarily forget the mountain of medical bills waiting on the kitchen table. Coffee, black. A hoarse male voice drifted from the far corner. I grabbed the pot, ignoring the brief sting when my hand brushed the metal handle. Night shifts in South Philly were always quiet like this. Just a few regulars and the occasional truck driver stopping in to rest. Maybe that was why I noticed him immediately. He sat alone at the last table, right against the red brick wall, the farthest place from the entrance. His black suit framed his tall, broad body, the fluorescent lights glinting off. Every perfect fold of fabric, yet none of it dimmed the darkness he carried with him. It was as if his presence made the air heavier, denser, harder to breathe. I had never seen him before, yet something about him set off every instinct for caution. From the way he sat completely still, as though every movement was measured, to the depthless black of his eyes tracking each shift inside the diner like a watchman guarding invisible boundaries. "Here you go," I said softly, placing the cup in front of him, my fingers trembling just a little. Steam rose from the coffee, forming a thin veil between us, a fragile curtain I knew would never stop him if he ever chose to cross it. He didn't thank me. Instead, his eyes slid slowly across my face, pausing on the bruise at my temple I had tried to hide under cheap makeup. A leftover trace from the last time Kyle, my ex-boyfriend, laid his hands on me before vanishing with every dollar I had saved over 3 long years. "You're new." His voice came again, not a question but a statement carved in stone. It was soft like velvet, yet beneath it lay something sharp as a razor blade. "I've worked here for 2 years," I replied quickly, without thinking. A flicker crossed his eyes, maybe amusement, maybe annoyance at being contradicted. "I meant," he leaned forward slightly, "you're new to me." The way he said it sent a cold shiver straight down my spine. As if this diner, this neighborhood, even the storm outside belonged to him, and I had just been added to that list. If the moment Graham speaks Sam's name in that low velvet voice, or the way he watches her in the cold midnight diner, makes you hold your breath the same way she does, then make sure to subscribe to our channel, hit like, and share this video so you won't miss the unfolding mystery ahead. And, where are you watching from? Leave your city or your country below, so I'll know just how far the story of Sam and the man made of shadows named Graham has traveled across this world. I stepped back, still clutching the coffee pot like it was the one thing that could shield me from the man in front of me. His eyes never left me, cold and cutting, peeling away the thin layers of armor I put on every day just to function. I couldn't tell if I was afraid or simply too tired to resist, but my body froze as he tilted his head, observing me gently, almost curiously, as if I were a puzzle waiting to be solved. A bead of rain slid from his damp hair down the collar of his crisp white shirt beneath the black suit jacket, soaking the shoulder as though the storm did not dare disturb his composure. He was perhaps the only man I had ever seen who looked more formidable drenched in rain. I tried to keep my voice steady as I asked, "Would you like anything else?" The question sounded more like a plea for permission to retreat. A brief silence followed. Then his lips lifted slightly, not quite a smile, more a subtle flicker of interest. "Coffee is enough." He brought the cup to his lips, drinking slowly. "I like it without sugar, without cream, and without lies." I could not tell if that was meant to be a joke or a test. Either way, all I could do was nod, trying to hide the quickening thump of my heart. As I turned to walk away, his voice wrapped around me again, quieter now but unyielding. "What is your name?" I hesitated. A simple question, yet from him it felt weighted like a vow. I should lie. I should give any name but my own. But instead I heard myself whisper, "Sam." He repeated it softly, tasting each letter. "Sam." The sound of it left his mouth strangely tender before settling in the space between us like an irreversible mark. "I'm Graham," he added, still holding the cup, his gaze locked on me. No last name, no title, just a name, Graham. But the way he said it made me feel as if I should have known him already, or at least understood that he was not someone one simply forgets. A car pulled up outside, headlights cutting through the rain-streaked glass. Graham turned his head for a single heartbeat, but it was enough for me to see his hand shift beneath the table. Quick, certain, reflexive. When he looked back, something in his eyes had changed, still calm, but with a layer of cold steel beneath the surface. "You finish at midnight." It wasn't a question. It sounded as though he had already studied my schedule. A chill threaded down my spine. "How do you know that?" I whispered. He didn't answer right away. He set the cup down, his gaze never wavering. "I need a favor, Sam, and I am willing to pay dearly for it. I should walk away, say I had nothing to give him." But my mother's voice from the night before crept into my memory, thin and brave, as she talked about her next round of chemotherapy. The pile of bills waiting at home tugged me back into place. I looked at him. "What kind of favor?" My voice barely sounded, like my own. Graham's lips curved, this time unmistakably, the expression of a predator watching its prey step willingly into the snare. "Pretend to be my girlfriend." I blinked, certain I had misheard. The words echoed inside my head like a foreign bell, absurd and dangerous all at once, leaving me speechless. "Pretend to be my girlfriend," Graham repeated, slower this time, his eyes fixed on mine as though waiting to see where my disbelief would break. I stared at him, trying to understand whether this was some strange joke or a twisted psychological test, but his face remained composed, utterly serious. "Why me?" I managed to ask, my voice rough with tension. "I'm not special. You could choose anyone." Graham tilted his head slightly, his expression calm, though his eyes were sharp enough to cut. "I don't need someone special. I need someone real. Someone who does not ask questions. Someone who has a reason to say yes." I went still. The sentence struck, straight into the center of my chest. He had seen me. He had noticed the worn-down shoes, the faded uniform, the bruise I had tried to hide. He had read me like a thin paperback. And the worst part was, he was right. "I don't know who you are," I whispered, "and I don't do things like that." "Nothing illegal," Graham replied quickly. "No body involved, just presence. Conversation, impression. My family wants to see me settled. My grandmother is very sick. She wants to know I am stable." His tone was steady, but I heard something tremble beneath the word sick, a small fracture of vulnerability that made me pause. "And you need me to play that part?" "Yes, 2 months. Only 2 months." He slipped a hand inside his jacket and placed a thick envelope on the table between us. I didn't need to open it to know it was money. He seemed to read the thought. 30,000 now, 30,000 at the end, 60,000 total. Enough to cover the treatments, the trial medications, and give you a clean start if you want to leave afterward. My throat tightened. 60,000. Enough to pay off everything. Enough to bring my mother to the big hospital she once dreamed of but never dared mention aloud. I had never been offered anything easy in my entire life. And now a stranger placed in front of me something I thought existed only in movies. I should stand up and walk away. I should refuse. But instead I heard myself ask, what exactly would I need to do? Graham didn't smile. Not quite, but the corner of his mouth twitched. "From tonight on, you'll live at my home. We will attend gatherings, family dinners, social events. You only need to learn the basics about me to tell a believable story. I have someone who will prepare everything. And you will always wear this necklace." He pulled out a small velvet box and opened it. Inside was a platinum chain with a stylized letter G set with a tiny diamond-like stone. But I knew immediately it was not simply jewelry. "A tracker," he confirmed when he saw my reaction. "I need to know you are safe. If you remove it, the agreement ends." It felt as though I had stepped into a story with no exit. But perhaps for me, exiting was no longer an option. I looked out the window. The rain still poured relentlessly. The future was a blur, and my mother was waiting for a miracle. I drew in a deep breath and nodded. "I agree." Graham rose immediately, handing me a black business card with embossed letters. No address, no title, only a phone number and a name. Graham Bennett. "I am giving you 30 minutes to gather your things. My driver will be waiting outside." He said nothing else before walking out into the storm, leaving me with the rain, an envelope of money, and a decision that would alter the entire shape of my life. I no longer cared that my shift was not over or how Lou would react. I only knew I needed to go. Slipping off the body's faded apron, I placed it gently on the counter. a strange mix of emotions swirling inside me, then hurried out into the night. The rain still had not eased when I stepped out of the diner, moving quickly across puddles that glimmered under the streetlights as I walked toward the black SUV waiting along the curb. The door unlocked without my knocking, and the man behind the wheel only nodded when I climbed in, offering no greeting, no words at all. The air inside carried the scent of genuine leather, so pristine it felt emotionless, just like everything that bore the name Graham Bennett. I held my small canvas bag tightly against my chest, the bag containing a few changes of clothes, a notebook, and a photograph of my mother, the only pieces of my old life I had managed to bring, as if clutching the final remnants of who I had been. The drive lasted nearly 40 minutes through quiet residential neighborhoods, growing more deserted as the SUV turned down tree-lined roads where the streetlights thinned and the houses gave way to towering iron gates and sprawling estates. The gate opened automatically as we approached, revealing a wide stone courtyard and a massive main house rising through the thin curtain of rain like a hidden castle. My breath caught. The 3-story mansion, built of gray stone with steep slate roofs and the tallest of windows, glowed softly from within. Warm amber light spilled through the misty rain, turning the structure from something cold into something ancient, quiet, and dangerous. The car door opened. I stepped out, my shoes soaking instantly, my shoulders trembling with cold and tension. A silver-haired woman with her hair tidily pinned back and her posture perfectly straight in an elegant black uniform opened the front door before I reached it. "Miss Walker, I am Mrs. Delaney, the Bennett housekeeper. Please come inside." Her voice was low and steady, each word cutting cleanly through the air. I crossed the threshold and was immediately overwhelmed. A marble floor stretched across the foyer, reflecting the glow of an enormous crystal chandelier suspended overhead. Everything was unnervingly silent, broken only by the faint patter of rain against the roof, as though the house itself was holding its breath while watching me. Oil paintings in gilded frames lined the walls on both sides, mostly Italian landscapes and classical portraits, whose eyes seemed to follow me as I moved. A grand oak staircase curved upward, its banister intricately carved and polished to a shine untouched by dust. The space carried the unmistakable weight of old wealth, quiet, restrained, yet impossible to ignore, reminding you with every detail who held power here. "Your room is on the second floor, south wing, beside the library. Mr. Bennett has had clothing, personal items, and other necessities prepared for you, Mrs. Delaney said, turning to lead the way. I followed silently, feeling as though a stone sat heavily in my chest. Each step on the wooden hallway floor echoed too loudly, as if to remind me I did not belong here. She stopped at a dark wooden door and opened it to reveal a room larger than the tiny apartment I once lived in. A large bed with crisp white linens, a built-in wardrobe with brass handles, thick floor-to-ceiling drapes, and a walnut vanity positioned beside a window overlooking the back garden. I stepped inside. The warm lighting softened the space, making it appear inviting, even gentle, yet beneath the perfection lurked something cold. Perhaps it was the absence of human presence. Perhaps it was the absolute silence. Or perhaps it was simply because I knew, from the moment I crossed this threshold, that I was no longer free. On the vanity sat the velvet box Graham had shown me earlier. The necklace remained inside, the stylized G glittering under the light. It was small, elegant, and terrifyingly beautiful. I didn't need anyone to remind me that from now on every step I took would be monitored, every breath noted. This was not just a home. It was a gilded cage, where nothing was accidental and everything was controlled. I stood in the breathtaking room, hearing my heartbeat echo in my ribs, and wondered, what exactly had I agreed to, and was there any way back? I was still standing motionless in that unfamiliar room, when a soft knock sounded 3 gentle, decisive taps. Before I could answer, the door opened, and Graham stepped inside, without noise, without asking permission, as if this space belonged to him the same way every other part of this world did. He wore a white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, revealing strong forearms laced with distinct veins. The suffocating black suit was gone, yet his presence carried the same commanding weight, and I instinctively took a step back. Graham surveyed the room, then turned to me, his expression unreadable. "Is everything all right?" I nodded, unsure my voice would hold steady if I spoke. He walked to the vanity, opened the velvet box, and lifted the necklace, turning the pendant between his fingers. "We need to establish a few things," he said, his voice not loud but unmistakably clear in the stillness of the room. "This arrangement will last 8 weeks. During that time, you will stay here, attend family events, private gatherings, and several important social occasions with me. You will learn basic information about me, and together we will create a believable story of our relationship." I nodded again, my heart hammering when he placed the necklace into my hands. "And this is non-negotiable," he continued, meeting my eyes directly. "You must wear it at all times, even when you sleep." I glanced down at the pendant, the tiny stone catching the light, looking deceptively delicate, though I knew better. "A tracking device?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "And a microphone," he replied without hesitation. "It activates only when necessary, but I need absolute safety for you, and for myself." "What about privacy?" I asked, unable to hide the bitterness in my tone. "I gave that up the moment I walked in here, didn't I?" Graham paused before responding. "Not gave up, set aside. We are playing a dangerous game, Sam. And in this game, even a moment of carelessness can cost a life." I bit down hard on my lip, unsure whether it was his seriousness or the growing instinct in me that he was telling the truth that unsettled me more. He reached into his shirt pocket and placed a sheet of paper on the table, along with a pen. "A contract. It outlines the payment, the conditions, and the limits of liability. The first half has already been transferred to your account. The remaining half will be paid at the end of the 8 weeks." I lifted the pen, my hand trembling slightly. Skimming through the terms, I noticed my mother's name listed under medical expenses, a stark reminder that I had no way out. "I have one condition," I said, lowering the pen before signing. Graham raised a brow. "I want to visit my mother twice a week, and no one interferes with her treatment." He considered for a few seconds before nodding. "Agreed. I will personally make sure of it." I signed my name. It happened so quickly it felt unreal. When the tip of the pen left the final line, it was as though I had closed a door behind me and thrown away the key. Graham picked up the necklace and stepped closer. "Allow me," he said softly, fastening the chain around my neck, the cold metal pressing briefly against my skin like an invisible vow. When he withdrew his hand, our eyes met. I caught something flicker in his gaze, something like the faintest shadow of regret, but it vanished before I could grasp it. "From this moment on," he said quietly, "you are not allowed to disappear." I didn't respond. I only stood there, my fingers rising instinctively to touch the pendant that now rested heavily against my collarbone, not because of its weight, but because I knew it marked the point from which there was no return. I could not sleep the entire night, not because the bed was too soft or because I was unused to the vast, cold expanse of the room, but because a strange weight clung to every cell in my body, as if I were lying in a place that was not real, a place too perfect to possibly be true. The dim light spilling from the hallway through the narrow crack under the door kept the room from ever becoming fully dark. I turned over for what felt like the 10th restless time, my hand drifting up unconsciously to the necklace resting against my collarbone. It was no longer cold, yet it still felt as heavy as a chain. Morning began with a perfectly timed knock. Mrs. Delaney entered carrying a breakfast tray, arranged with the precision of a 5-star hotel: an omelet, toasted bread, orange juice, and coffee. I thanked her but touched nothing except the coffee. My mind was a tangled mess of worry, confusion, and questions that had no answers. After breakfast, she guided me to a private dressing room. The space was filled with dresses, heels, handbags, and jewelry, all arranged by color palette, season, and occasion. It felt as though someone had dissected my entire life and assembled a flawless image of what a believable girlfriend for Graham Bennett should look like. I was asked to choose a simple but elegant outfit for lunch with him. I chose a pale beige dress that reached my knees, with soft sleeves and fabric that clung just enough to feel comfortable without drawing too much attention. When I walked downstairs, Graham was already waiting in the dining room. He was reading something on a tablet, a cup of coffee, and a neatly folded newspaper beside him. He did not speak when I walked in. He simply glanced up, his eyes quietly assessing. "Good," he said after a moment. "You look appropriate." I could not tell whether it was praise or acknowledgement, but I nodded. Lunch passed in silence. He ate simply, neatly, every movement appearing practiced and controlled. It struck me then that he did not only control others, he controlled himself, to an almost impossible degree. After lunch, I was taken on a tour of the mansion, though it felt more like mandatory orientation. Mrs. Delaney pointed out the areas I was allowed to enter: the living room, the library, the back garden, and the gym on the ground floor. Several doors remained permanently shut, and I did not need to ask to know I was forbidden to step anywhere near them. Small cameras mounted at the corners of the walls followed my every movement. They were not hidden, not disguised, and that was what unsettled me most. I began to feel like a carefully placed collectible, displayed correctly, preserved meticulously, but no longer part of any world that resembled freedom. During the next few days, I adjusted to the new rhythm. Each morning, clothes were laid out for me. Each afternoon, I had etiquette lessons and study sessions, information about Graham, his family, his preferences, his habits, even trivial things like what wine he preferred or which nuts he was allergic to, and who he had once loved. I studied as though preparing for a major performance. The only difference was that I did not know when the performance would end or when it might become my reality. I began to understand the real cost of $60,000. It was not money. It was freedom. It was dreamless sleep. It was the ability to walk down a street without being watched. It was the simple act of touching my own neck, without remembering I was being monitored. And the worst part was that even though he was never in the same room for long, Graham knew exactly what I was doing every moment of the day. Just as he had promised, I was not allowed to disappear. And slowly, I was no longer sure I was still myself. That morning began no differently from any other. I woke in the enormous quiet room, put on the dress that had been prepared, ate breakfast in silence, and was then invited to the library for my daily role training. But something was different. The documents Mrs. Delaney handed me were not files about Graham or the Bennett family, as usual, but a thinner packet clipped neatly together, marked at the top with my own name, Samantha Walker. The moment I opened the first page, every breath in my chest tightened as if caught in a fist. Inside was a disturbingly detailed record of my life: where I was born, the high school I attended, the hospital where my mother was receiving treatment, every job I had worked, even a copy of the application I submitted to Lou's Diner 3 years earlier, complete with my messy signature at the bottom. I gripped the papers tightly, my heart pounding as I turned the next pages. There were photographs of me outside the small grocery store near my old apartment, pictures of my mother and me sitting on a park bench in the late afternoon, an image of me standing outside the clinic with swollen eyes after hearing the cost of the special chemotherapy treatment for the first time. Photos I never knew were taken. Private moments I believed belonged only to my mother and me, now laid bare in the hands of a man I barely understood. I stood abruptly, leaving the library and walking quickly down the long wooden hallway, my palms growing damp with cold sweat. I did not need to ask who had gathered all of this. I found Graham in his office at the end of the corridor, the door slightly open. He stood with his back to me, sunlight from the window outlining the sharp lines of his cheek and the crisp white fabric of his shirt. I stepped inside, the documents still clutched in my hand. "How long have you been watching me?" I asked, my voice raw, cutting straight to the truth. Graham did not turn immediately. He set down his fountain pen, lifted his head as if gathering a thought from the garden outside, and only then slowly faced me. His eyes were calm, but for the first time I saw a flicker of caution. "Ever since the first time you were denied medical assistance for lack of funds," he said. "I have someone in the hospital system. They do not reveal anything private. They simply let you know everything." I cut in, my fingers tightening around the edge of the papers. "You know every step I take, every breath I breathe. You know where my mother is treated, what I eat for breakfast. You didn't choose me because I happened to be at that diner, did you?" Graham walked toward me, slow but certain. "No, it was not coincidence. I knew you were the right fit. No one else had motives as clear as yours. And you had no dangerous debts, no affiliations, no ties that could compromise you." A laugh escaped me, a strangled, bitter sound. "So I'm a clean asset, easy to manage, a perfect pawn in your game." "Not a pawn," he said quietly. "The only person I believed could survive stepping into my world without being crushed." I stepped back, my eyes burning, a heavy stone swelling in my chest. I did not know what hurt more, that he had known everything about me from the beginning, or that I had started, even faintly, to trust him. "I'm not a project, Graham," I said, my voice trembling. I'm a person. I don't need your pity or your protection." He was silent, his dark eyes deep as a well, unblinking. "I know," he said softly, "and that is exactly why I chose you. Not because you are weak, but because you are stronger than you think." I said nothing. I only clutched the packet of papers, holding tight to what little remained of my pride. Then I left his office, each step heavy. And the only thought echoing in my mind was this: I entered this arrangement to save my mother, but perhaps I was the one who needed to be saved. I did not speak to Graham for 3 days after that. We still sat at the same table, still appeared together, when necessary, still played our roles smoothly before the staff and the occasional visitors. But between us stood a distance as thick and impenetrable as reinforced glass. He did not attempt to explain further, and I was not ready to forgive. I spent most of my time in the library, the only place where I felt I was still myself, or at least what was left of me. That afternoon, as I sat reading an old novel, the door opened. It was not Graham. It was Victor Russo, the cousin I had only glimpsed briefly once during my first dinner here. He walked in with a lazy confidence and a slanted smile, as though he had come intentionally to disturb the quiet. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said, his eyes scanning the book in my hand. "If Graham were here, he'd probably tell you not to read things like that. He likes to control both the minds and the emotions of the people around him." I did not respond. I simply closed the book and set it down. Victor moved closer and sat across from me without waiting to be invited. "I know who you are, Sam," he said, lowering his voice, slow and measured. "And I know who Kyle is." The moment that name left his mouth, my entire body went rigid. I had never mentioned Kyle here. I had told no one. "Did you think Graham was the only one who knew everything about people?" Victor tilted his head, his gray eyes narrowing as if savoring my reaction. "Did you think he chose you by chance, or that he didn't know what Kyle used to be?" I drew a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady. "Kyle is the past. He has nothing to do with this." Victor laughed softly, a sound edged with ridicule. "Oh, but he does. Kyle is not just your ex-boyfriend. He is an informant for the organization opposing the Bennetts, a DeLuca man. And you should know, you were brought here not just because Graham needed a pleasant face by his side. You were chosen because you are bait. And Kyle is the fish." I stood abruptly, my heartbeat hammering against my ribs. "You're lying." "No," Victor said, his tone suddenly sharp. "I am warning you. Graham did not tell you because he wants your trust. But the truth is, you are standing in the middle of a war, Sam, and you are not neutral. You are the weakness Kyle will never let go of." I left the library without hearing anything more, my mind buzzing as if struck by a heavy blow. I walked straight to Graham's room, did not knock, and pushed the door open to face him. He was standing by the window, turning when he heard me enter. "You knew who Kyle was," I said immediately. "And you knew what organization he worked for. And yet you still let me walk into this without warning." Graham did not deny it. He simply nodded, his eyes heavier than I had ever seen them. "I knew. And I chose silence because I needed you here." "So all of this was a plan," I said, stepping back, my voice nearly breaking. "You used me as bait to draw Kyle out." "No," he said quickly, his voice rough and low. "That was the beginning, but after that, nothing was part of the plan anymore." I shook my head, feeling the ground tilt beneath me. I remembered every touch, every glance, every moment he had seemed concerned. All of it felt like lies. "I cannot trust you anymore," I whispered. Graham took one step toward me, but I turned and walked away, for the first time feeling truly afraid. Not of Graham, not of Kyle, but because I no longer knew who in this world was real. And in this game of shadows and power, it seemed I had never been the one holding the pieces. I moved quickly down the long hallway, my palms clenched so tightly that my nails pressed into my skin, though I felt no pain. I only wanted to get away from his room, away from his cold eyes mixed with something I still could not name. But before I reached the staircase, he caught up, his large hand closing around my wrist, pulling me back. "Sam, don't walk away like that," he said, his voice low and gravelly, but still carrying that familiar, unbearable control. "Let me go," I answered, not loudly, but with a weight that left no room for argument. Graham released me instantly, as if the act of respecting my boundaries mattered more to him than anything else. But he did not step away. "Let me explain." "Explain what, Graham? That I am a tool? A trap? A piece of bait you chose because I was predictable enough, weak enough, desperate enough to stand exactly where you needed me?" My voice trembled, but not from fear. Not this time. Graham drew a deep breath, as if preparing to say something he had avoided for a very long time. "Yes, I chose you because of Kyle." My chest tightened, even though I had known the answer before asking. Hearing him say it tore something open anyway. "So you never cared about me. Not because I was the right fit, not because I was real. Only because I once loved the wrong man." Graham shook his head, stepping closer, his eyes filled with regret, something I had never truly seen in him. "It is not what you think. At first, yes, I needed you to force Kyle out of hiding. He stole something important from me, and he is the one man I could not reach unless he had a reason to surface. And I was the perfect lure," I whispered. He closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them again, meeting my gaze without flinching. "I was wrong not to tell you from the beginning." "Wrong?" I laughed, the sound brittle like shattered glass. "You turned my life into a weapon. You invaded every part of who I am. You knew my mother was sick. You knew I was desperate. And you used that." "Yes." He did not retreat, did not soften it. "I used you." The honesty struck me like a blow. I wanted him to deny it. I wanted him to lie. I wanted anything other than the unforgiving truth. "Why me?" I asked, my voice cracking for the first time. "Out of hundreds of people you could have used, why me?" Graham looked at me for a long moment, as though choosing his words carefully, knowing each one could break me further. But perhaps it was already too late. "Because you do not belong to his world," he said softly. "Because you are clean. Because Kyle would never imagine I would bring someone like you into this game. And because I believed you were strong enough not to be destroyed." "You do not get to decide that," I said, tears sliding down my cheeks, hot and exhausting. "Nothing in my life is for you to decide." Graham stepped closer until only a narrow space separated us. He lifted a hand as if intending to wipe my tears, but stopped halfway, letting it fall instead. For the first time, he looked unsure of himself. "You are right," he said, his voice much quieter. "I crossed the line. I used your pain for my own purpose. But Sam..." He inhaled slowly, his fist tightening at his side. "Everything after that stopped being part of the plan." I shook my head, unwilling to hear more, but he continued anyway. "I deserve your anger. I deserve for you to walk away. But I never wanted you hurt. Not by me. Not by Kyle. Not by anyone. You cannot lock me in here and tell me you want to protect me." Graham stepped back slightly, his expression torn, as if he himself were being split open. "If you want to leave, I will let you go." My heart stopped for a beat. I had not expected him to say that. "But you need to know Kyle is looking for you. That is not a prediction. It is fact. And when he finds you without me..." He paused, his voice dropping into something almost pleading. "You will not be safe." I swallowed the rising tide of fear. I do not know who to believe anymore. Graham looked at me with an expression I had never seen on him before, arrogance and despair, strength and vulnerability, all tangled together. "Then let me prove it. Not with words anymore, but with action." I stood still, suspended between two equally terrifying paths, leaving and facing a man I once loved who had become a shadow with no trace of kindness left, or staying with a man who deceived me but might be the only shield I had left. And for the first time, I realized the conflict between us was no longer about a contract. It was about survival. And about a truth I was not yet ready to name. I did not leave the estate. Not because I trusted Graham again so quickly, but because some instinct deep within me whispered that if I stepped through that gate now, I might never return intact. Yet staying did not mean I had forgiven him. Between us stretched a silence hard to name, a thin thread pulled so tight with suspicion and hurt that even the slightest movement might snap it. And that evening, I was expected to play the part of a tender lover before a powerful family I understood nothing about except their name. Dinner was held in the grand west dining room of the mansion. The walls were paneled with dark wood, hung with old paintings, and lit by a row of Italian crystal chandeliers. Under the warm amber glow, every glass, Every fork, every plate gleamed as though meticulously polished for scrutiny. I wore the soft wine-colored dress Delaney had chosen, along with heels that forced my back straighter and made my steps slower, more deliberate. Graham appeared beside me at the perfect moment, as though he had been waiting behind the door. He offered his hand. I hesitated for a heartbeat before placing mine into his. His hand was warm, steady, familiar in a way that unsettled me. When the dining room doors opened, a wave of red wine, roasted meat, and expensive perfume flowed out like an invisible mist that made my head light. 8 people were already seated around the table. At the head sat an older woman with silver hair, her posture immaculate, her gaze sharp as a blade. I knew instantly she was Carmela Bennett, the woman Graham had told me, was the reason for this entire charade. Beside her were 2 middle-aged men, uncles or cousins, perhaps each watching me with a quiet mix of curiosity and judgment. On the other side was a woman in a jade dress and pearl necklace, her expression cool, and a younger man absorbed in his phone. Every head lifted as we entered. Graham introduced me as his girlfriend in a calm, unhurried voice, as though the matter required no explanation. I smiled politely, nodded, my hand still lightly hooked around his arm for balance. Carmela stared at me without blinking. "Samantha Walker," she said slowly, as if tasting each syllable. "Where do you come from?" "Boston, ma'am," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "And what do you do?" "I worked at a small diner. Recently, I left." "Because of Graham?" The question cut like a knife. I could not tell whether it was a test or an insult. I kept my smile. "Because of my family circumstances. But yes, Graham helped me change my family. Life." Carmela nodded, slowly, though her eyes never left me. "Change it how?" "With money?" Before I could speak, Graham answered. "Grandmother," he said, his tone quietly warning. "She is my guest. And she is the woman I love." Silence fell over the table like a sudden shift in pressure. I could hear my heart beat, each thump painfully clear. Carmela's gaze sharpened even further. "Do you love Graham?" I had known the question was coming, but not that it would strike so directly. I could have lied. I could have played the perfect devoted lover. But as I looked into her old, piercing eyes, I chose something far more dangerous: honesty. "I am learning to trust him," I said slowly. "And if trust is a kind of love, then perhaps I am beginning." The table went utterly still. Graham turned toward me, and I caught a glimmer of something soft in his eyes, something almost tender, as though my words had been an unexpected gift. Carmela said nothing else. She lifted her wineglass, took a small sip, and set it down. "You appear smarter than you look." I could not tell whether it was praise or a veiled warning, perhaps both. The evening continued under a tension stretched thin as wire. I answered questions dressed as polite conversation. Graham never strayed far from my side. But I knew that every word I spoke, every gesture, every glance in that room was being memorized, parsed, and sorted into silent boxes of trust or suspicion inside each mind present. When dinner ended and I left the room with Graham, I felt as though I had survived an exam no one had announced, but whether I passed, that depended on more than a well-timed truth. The next morning, I woke with a heaviness that felt like the lingering taste of the night before. Carmela's knife-edged questions, the silent evaluations from every seat around the table, and the subtle but unmistakable pressure of Graham's hand around mine as I answered everything clung to me like a thin, invisible bruise. I planned to seek refuge in the library when Delaney appeared, informing me that Victor wished to see me. I was not surprised. He was not the kind of man who let go of a puzzle easily, especially one he had not yet fully understood. In the back garden, Victor stood leaning against a stone balustrade overlooking the fountain. He wore his shirt unbuttoned at the top, a glass of wine in hand, although it was barely past 9 in the morning. "I thought after last night you'd run for the hills," he said when he saw me, his voice threaded with amusement. "I'm impressed you're still here." "Maybe I'm not as predictable as you think," I replied, keeping a safe distance. He smirked, letting his gaze sweep over me as though reassessing the value of something he had underestimated. "That's what makes you different from the dolls Graham used to bring home. There's something about you that feels real." "I'm not here to talk about me," I said, sharply, keeping my voice even. Victor stepped closer, his expression sharpening. "Then let me ask you this. What do you think Graham really is?" I did not answer immediately. The question sounded simple, but behind it lay countless motives. "He is a man with goals," I said at last, "and someone who will do anything to reach them. But I haven't decided yet whether that makes him admirable or frightening." Victor laughed, a short, dry sound. "A clever answer, but Graham is not as simple as you think, and someone like you, if not careful, will be swallowed whole." "What do you want from me, Victor?" I asked, losing patience. He took another step forward, close enough that I could smell mint and wine on his breath. "I want to help you. I know Graham hasn't told you everything. You think he chose you because you're special? You're just a piece in a game far bigger than you understand. But if you're smart, you can tilt the board." "How exactly?" Victor narrowed his eyes, his mouth curling into a half-smile. "You could get everything Graham promised, even more, if you choose the right side. And that side is not Graham." "What do you mean?" "It's—" A chill slid down my spine. "I have resources you know nothing about. If you help me information, a few timely actions, that's all. After that, you'll be free. Your mother will be treated in the best hospital money can buy, and you'll never have to play the fake girlfriend role again." I stepped back. "And if I refuse?" Victor smiled as though he had expected the reaction. "Then I wait. Everyone has a price. It's only a matter of time." He walked away, leaving me in the sunlit garden that felt colder than the night I first met Graham. I had just glimpsed another layer of this world, where every word and smile might be a hidden blade. Graham had once used me as bait. Now Victor wanted to turn me into something else, a traitor, a double agent. I walked back into the grade, mansion, my mind spinning with new fractures. The question echoing inside me was no longer who I could trust, but how long I could remain myself before becoming just another piece on a board no one would ever truly win. I returned to the estate with my pulse racing, my hand still carrying the ghostly chill of the wineglass Victor had pressed into it before offering his sweetly wrapped trap. I had no time to collect myself before Delaney summoned me to the drawing room, where the Bennett family was gathering for afternoon tea with several board members of their corporation. The room smelled of lavender and black tea, and the late-day sunlight filtered through silk curtains, making everything appear far too serene compared with the chaos churning in my thoughts. When I stepped inside, Graham was already there, standing beside Carmela, dressed in a charcoal suit so sharply tailored that even the creases projected control. He lifted his gaze when he saw me, something like relief mixed with scrutiny flickering across his eyes. But what startled me more was Victor's gaze from across the room, watching me over the rim of his glass with that half-smile like a spectator waiting for a scene to unfold. I took the seat beside Graham at Carmela's instruction. The atmosphere was both polite and taut, every exchange coated with courtesy yet heavy with subtle tests. I could feel Victor's eyes on me throughout, making concentration nearly impossible, until Victor spoke. "Sam is quite fascinating," he said, his voice lilting as though savoring each word. "I had the pleasure of speaking with her this morning in the garden. We talked about many things, Italian wine, life choices. My body went rigid, but I kept silent." Graham turned to Victor, his gaze freezing into something cold and sharp. "I don't recall asking my cousin to probe into my girlfriend's personal affairs," he said, his tone calm but edged. Victor shrugged, entirely unfazed. "I simply take interest in new additions to the family, especially those who seem miscast for the role." That was no longer small talk. It was a strike, aimed at both me and Graham. Carmela looked at me, then at Graham. No one else spoke. The air thickened. "I believe Sam fits the role better than anyone who has ever stood beside me," Graham said at last, his voice dropping but each word delivered with clarity. "And if anyone in this room doubts that, they might consider how she is sitting here today composed, while surrounded by people who would tear her apart simply for not meeting their expectations." Every gaze shifted toward me. I kept my eyes on my teacup, my palms damp but my shoulders steady, as if I truly were as calm as he claimed. Victor let out a soft scoff, placing his glass down with a gentle clink. "It was just an opinion, cousin. No need to bare your teeth." "I don't defend her because I must," Graham replied, his eyes never leaving Victor. "I defend her because I want to. And I will not allow anyone, not even family, to make her feel unwelcome here." His words were not loud, nor dramatic, but heavy enough that I felt the shift ripple through the room. Even Victor fell silent. Carmela gave a small nod, a subtle signal to end the exchange. No one mentioned me again, but I knew I had become the center of a storm no one could quite avoid. When the tea concluded, Graham walked a few steps behind me as we left the room. Neither of us spoke until we reached the long hallway. "You didn't have to do that," I said quietly, without looking at him. "I did," he replied, his voice softer now. "Not just because they questioned you, but because you don't deserve to be used as a pawn anymore. Not by me, not by Victor, not by anyone." I turned to him then. His eyes held none of the anger or arrogance I had come to associate with him, only something earnest enough that for a brief moment I wanted to believe him. Graham may have once used me as bait, but in that moment he stood beside me not to advance a plan, but because he wanted me to know that this time I was not alone. The trip was announced the next morning with nothing more than a simple sentence from Graham as I stepped into the dining room. He was taking me to see my mother today. No explanation, no reasoning, no detailed plan, just a firm promise that made my heart tighten. We left mid-morning. The air in Philadelphia was wrapped in mist, the early October chill settling over the city like a damp shawl. Graham drove in silence, and I did not speak either. Yet the quiet between us no longer felt heavy. It was the kind of silence that gave thoughts room to breathe, the kind that allowed emotions to settle without needing to hide. The hospital sat on the outskirts of the city, tucked inside a quiet neighborhood lined with maple trees just beginning to turn gold. When the car stopped, I turned to him. "Why today?" He did not look at me. He opened the door and said softly, "Because you need something real, something untouched by the game everyone is playing." I said nothing and followed him inside. My mother's room was unchanged, small, simple, but clean. When I walked in, she was reading, her glasses slipping down her nose. Her eyes, dimmed by medication, brightened the moment she saw me. I rushed to her, wrapped my arms around her, and for a moment, everything I had been holding together fractured. I didn't cry, but I held her tighter than usual, trying to tell her without words that I was still standing even if the world outside seemed determined to break me. Graham stood at the doorway, not entering but not leaving either. His expression softened as he watched me talk to her, laugh with her, sit close to her. And when my mother asked quietly who he was, he stepped forward, rested one hand on the back of her chair, and said gently, "I'm the one who will take care of Samantha. Not her boyfriend, not her future husband. Just the one who would take care of me." Something in the way he said it made me lift my head not out of surprise, but because for the first time I heard Graham speak without the armor of authority. He spoke like a man setting aside every calculation so he could be present for a woman who deserved protection not as a pawn, but as a human being who felt and hurt. When we left the hospital, a light rain had begun to fall. Graham took me to a small cafe nearby, a place where no one recognized him, where there were no watchers and no cameras, only the sound of old jazz drifting through the speakers and the warm scent of baked pastries. He ordered coffee for me, remembering exactly how I liked it, and sat across from me as my fingers trembled over the spoon I stirred. "How long have you been paying the hospital bills?" I asked, keeping my eyes on the cup. "Since the first week you agreed to come to the estate," he replied. "I didn't want you worrying about anything beyond what you were already facing." "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I was afraid if you knew, you'd feel obligated to stay." I looked up at him, and in his eyes there was no trace of the feared Graham Bennett, no coldness, no distance. Only the truth of a man who was tired, alone, and trying to love someone in the only way he knew, even if that way was deeply flawed. I said nothing more. We simply sat there together, surrounded by rain and coffee, and a rare quiet that did not feel like confinement. For the first time, I did not feel watched. I did not feel held in place by contracts, jewelry, or promises. I stayed because I wanted to. And that changed everything. Not like a storm, more like a single drop of water. Quiet, but real. When we stepped back outside, the rain had eased, leaving only a faint mist that draped the street like a soft veil. Instead of driving straight back, Graham led me along the stone path that wound toward a nearby park. Fallen maple leaves covered the ground, forming a warm quilt of amber and gold beneath our feet. He walked in silence for a long time before speaking, his voice low and thoughtful, as though he was lifting each memory carefully from a locked place. "I used to hate autumn," he said, watching the trees sway, "because my father died on a day just like this. Light rain, gray sky, cold air but not freezing. I looked at him and saw his jaw tighten not with anger, but with the ache of an old wound pulled back into the light. He was assassinated right outside our home. I was 16, coming back from basketball practice. My mother was screaming. Carmela was on the phone with dozens of people, and I just stood there, staring at his blood spreading across the concrete. He paused, his mouth pressed into a thin line. I didn't speak. I waited. His death was a message, a purge, a warning to the Bennett family, because we refused to ally with DeLuca. They thought killing him would make us bend. He gave a short, humorless laugh. But Carmela did the opposite. She used his death to rebuild everything, and I was chosen to replace him. There was no time for grief, no room for emotion. After that day, I was no longer a child. His shoulders slumped slightly, and for the first time since I met him, he didn't look invincible. He looked like a 16-year-old boy who had lost his father in the most senseless way. I told myself if I was strong enough, cold enough, then nothing else could be taken from me. But then Kyle happened, and now, you. He turned to me, his gaze stripped of every barrier. You remind me that there are still things worth holding on to, and because of that, I'm afraid. I reached for his hand. For the first time, I was the one who initiated the touch. His palm was cold but tightened around mine instantly, as though he had been waiting for it without daring to ask. I'm afraid too, I whispered. Afraid of loving someone I might not be able to keep. But what scares me more is leaving now and never knowing whether we could have been real. He didn't answer. Instead, he moved closer, placed his other hand on my cheek softly, gently, like a man terrified of breaking something fragile. He waited, not demanding, not assuming, and I didn't pull away. We sat together on a damp wooden bench, hand in hand, saying nothing. Some truths didn't need words. Some silences held more comfort than 1,000 reassurances. In that moment, I was no longer Sam pretending to be a girlfriend, and he was no longer the cold, untouchable Mafia heir. We were just two wounded people, trying to find ourselves inside each other. Dusk settled as we returned to the car, the air turning cool enough to make me shiver. Graham walked around to open my door, then slid into the driver's seat in silence. The ride back was wrapped in a tender quiet, broken only by the whisper of wind and the steady beat of my heart as I glanced at him. The streetlights flickered across his face, that profile both familiar and suddenly new. Familiar because I had seen it every day. New because for the first time I was looking at him without the filter of doubt. When we reached the estate, Graham didn't turn off the engine immediately. He stared ahead, hands on the wheel, his thumb tapping as though his thoughts were circling something fragile. I began to speak, but he turned to me first, his voice low and rough. A question came without any warning, without preparation. Do you regret staying, Sam? I hesitated, then shook my head slowly, eyes never leaving his. No. He studied me for a long moment, as if searching my face for something he needed. Then he shut off the engine and stepped out of the car. I followed. At the top of the steps, he stopped and turned to face me. The space between us was barely half a step. The porch light illuminated the tension in his expression, something unsaid, something struggling to be spoken. His hand rose to my cheek, warm and careful, as if he feared the moment might disappear if he touched too quickly. I leaned into his palm, closing my eyes when I felt his breath brush against my skin. The kiss came unhurried. It wasn't fiery or cinematic, not wild like imagined passion. It was slow, steady, the kind of kiss where two people test the truth of something they never expected to find. His lips were warm, patient, carrying a quiet intensity as though he had waited a long time to touch me like this, and now that he finally could, he wanted to savor it. I didn't know how long we stood there, only that when he pulled back, his hands still cradled my face as if anchoring me in place. His eyes revealed everything he had kept hidden, and mine did too. No words were exchanged. None were needed. We had already spoken the truth in the silence that followed, without definitions, without promises, just a simple, private truth between two people who had been lost and hurt and now found something unnamed in each other. When he let go, I didn't step back. He smiled softly, barely there, then opened the door and guided me inside. And with every step, something in me shifted. Not because he kissed me, but because for the first time, I allowed myself to believe that something good could grow from a place where I once thought no light could reach. If anyone asked me what moment changed everything between us, I would not say it was the kiss. I would say it was the quiet pause afterward, when we looked at each other and knew neither of us was pretending anymore. 2 days after our first kiss, the Bennett estate seemed to shift into an entirely different state of being. The air hummed with a controlled kind of urgency as people moved through the halls preparing for the annual autumn gala the family hosted every year. But this time, Graham told me the moment the bedroom door closed behind us that morning, the event was not just a social gathering. It was a trap. "Kyle will be there," he said, his eyes fixed on the security grid glowing on his laptop screen. We detected one of his men transmitting an encrypted signal from an IP address that matches the guest list Victor handled. "He will not pass up the chance to get close to you in a place crowded enough that he thinks I cannot react fast enough." I gripped my warm coffee cup, my palms sweating even though the air outside was only around 10 degrees Celsius. "So I'm bait again?" Graham looked up, and his gaze softened in a way that stripped away every wall he usually carried. "Not bait. The center." I didn't know if that was truly different, but I nodded, because this time I wasn't agreeing blindly. This time I was fully awake to what I was stepping into. Delaney brought me to the special dressing room, where dozens of gowns hung in rich autumn tones, deep Bordeaux red, classic black, the blue of a midnight sky. She chose a black silk gown for me, long to my ankles, with a back that dipped low in a daring slit that somehow felt bold without being revealing. Graham stepped in just as I finished putting it on. For a few quiet seconds he simply stared, as though he had forgotten how to breathe. He moved toward me slowly and clasped a slender necklace around my neck, its small stone no larger than the tip of my little finger. I touched it. "A tracking device," he explained. "But no signal gets in except from my team." "Good," I said, turning to him. "I don't want anyone else finding me first." Graham nodded once. "We'll have 3 layers of security. The first is the regular guests, most of them people Victor brought in. The second is my people undercover as bodyguards, servers, even media staff. The last is an embedded tactical team that will only emerge if there's danger." "And I'll be in the middle?" I asked. "You'll be at my side. But you'll need to keep just enough distance to make Kyle believe he can reach you." "You think he'll do something in a place this crowded?" Graham didn't respond immediately. He only looked at me, long enough to make the back of my neck prickle. "A crowded room is perfect for him. He wants to hurt me, and nothing would satisfy him more than hurting you in front of everyone." I swallowed hard. His hand closed over mine, warm and steady. "But this time, he won't succeed. I promise." The afternoon blurred into private meetings, equipment checks, and reviews of the guest list. I memorized every side exit in the mansion, every service corridor, every camera blind spot. That night, while Delaney styled my hair at the vanity, I looked at my reflection and realized the woman staring back was no longer the diner waitress from that stormy evening. I was part of this world now, not because I had been dragged into it, but because I had chosen to be here. And tonight, I would not simply wait for something to happen. I would end it. Soft music drifted through the grand hall of the Bennett mansion, where crystal chandeliers sparkled like 1,000 captive stars suspended from the vaulted ceiling. Guests moved in graceful currents, each of them wrapped in elegance, their polished smiles hiding motives no one dared to confess. I stood beside Graham as we entered the central floor, and hundreds of eyes turned toward him. As the heir, as the symbol of power in his perfectly tailored black suit, he carried himself like the man who wrote the script for the night. I slipped my hand lightly around his arm like any woman in love might do, though both of us knew every breath was calculated and every gaze a form of silent communication. I spotted Victor near the bar, lifting his glass toward us in a gesture thick with meaning. Not far away sat Carmela, perched on a carved wooden chair by the staircase, her sharp eyes glancing over me for the briefest second, a reminder that nothing went unseen. Delaney, in a gown of deep emerald, circled the room with the composure of a meticulous secretary overseeing every detail. I inhaled deeply, smiling as if I were part of the celebration, but inside, I was stretched taut as wire, because I knew he would come, and he was never late. Nearly an hour after the gala began, once the guests had loosened up and the wine softened their tongues, I saw a familiar silhouette at the entrance. I recognized it before my eyes fully registered him. Tall frame, gray suit, clean jawline. That half-smile I used to know too well. Kyle. He walked in as if he belonged among the invited elite, shaking hands, wearing that practiced charm that once fooled me. His gaze swept the room and stopped exactly where I stood. For a breathless second, I couldn't breathe at all. Old memories surged like a filthy wave crashing against my ribs. Graham's hand at my back tightened slightly. His body went rigid. He saw him too. Kyle began moving toward us at a slow, confident pace, as though he were not the enemy. A server intercepted him just as trained, offering a glass of champagne. Kyle took it and raised it toward me in a distant, mocking salute. I forced a faint smile and whispered to Graham, "He won't try anything with this many people." Graham didn't answer. He subtly shifted his stance to place part of his body between Kyle and me, ready to move at the first sign of trouble. But Kyle didn't come straight to us. He circled the room, mingling, chatting, creating the illusion of a harmless guest. Only when the band shifted to a softer jazz number did he drift in behind me, close enough that his breath touched my ear. "You're still as beautiful as ever, Sam." I flinched, turning sharply. Graham instantly stepped forward, but Kyle had already stepped back with an innocent lift of his hand. "Just saying hello," he said with a smile. I forced my face to remain calm, though my fingers went numb. Kyle looked at Graham, the tension between them sharp enough to cut air. Then he turned, back to me. "May I borrow her for a dance?" I glanced at Graham. He held my gaze for a second, then gave the smallest nod. I knew this was part of the plan, but stepping willingly into the wolf's mouth still twisted my stomach into knots. Kyle extended his hand. I placed mine into it. His palm was still warm like I remembered, but now all I felt was revulsion. We stepped onto the dance floor as soft music flowed and the chandelier lights dimmed. "Do you remember the last time we danced?" he murmured. "In that tiny apartment with my broken record player. You said you'd be happy even if we were poor, and then you betrayed me," I said quietly, staring over his shoulder to keep my body from shaking. "I didn't betray you. I chose a side. You were just standing on the wrong one," he replied, his hand tightening around my waist. I steadied my breathing, but he sensed the tremor. "You're afraid," he whispered with a soft laugh. "Because you know I didn't. Come here just to talk." I looked around the room. People spun in lazy circles, unaware of the tension coiled between us. And then, as if rehearsed, Kyle guided me toward the edge of the ballroom. A side corridor appeared behind a heavy velvet curtain. "Come on," he said, the smile gone. "We need to talk without that bastard hovering." I opened my mouth to refuse, but he gripped my hand hard, pulling me toward the shadows. My pulse roared in my ears. I was being pulled away from the crowd, from Graham, from every watchful eye. And in that moment, only one thought anchored me. I needed to stay calm and stall, for Graham would not let me disappear without a fight. And this time, neither would I. I was pulled straight into the narrow passage behind the velvet curtain, where the light from the ballroom no longer reached. Kyle moved quickly, his hand clamped tightly around my wrist with enough force to make me follow. There was no one here, only a corridor leading toward a side exit, lined with red carpet, and a few old paintings hung like meaningless decorations. The air felt colder, and my heartbeat quickened when I realized no one could see us. "Let go," I said, keeping my voice steady. "We can talk right here." Kyle turned, his mouth twisting into a crooked smile. "No, there are eyes and ears for him here. I need to talk to you somewhere only the two of us exist, the way we used to be. I am not the girl you knew, Kyle. I am not that blind fool anymore." "No," he said with a dark nod. "Now you are Graham Bennett's toy." I didn't have time to react before he pushed me against the wall, not hard enough to hurt, but with enough force to trap me. His breath hovered near my face, the smell of wine mixed with an old cologne curling in my stomach. "Do you not understand, Sam? You are the perfect leverage. You weaken him, and I can make him fall to his knees if you do one simple thing." "No," I said, staring straight into his eyes. "I will not help you." Kyle laughed, a low, poisonous sound. "That's unfortunate, because I don't need your permission." And then footsteps echoed behind us. A faint metallic click hit the wall. Before Kyle could turn, Graham appeared, the suit he wore no longer looking like elegant attire but armor forged for battle. He didn't speak. He threw the first punch directly into Kyle's jaw, sending him stumbling. I stepped aside as the two men faced off in the narrow space. Kyle recovered quickly, swinging at Graham's ribs, but Graham blocked him with the sharp angle of his elbow. Their fight unfolded in the suffocating corridor with no cheers, No witnesses, only harsh breaths and the dull thud of fists striking flesh and brick. I pressed back into the curtain, shaking but not screaming. I trusted Graham. And as I believed, after the final blow, Kyle collapsed onto the floor, blood at the corner of his mouth, his eyes wide with shock. Graham stood panting, looking to him as though he had dragged a piece of his own past into the open and stamped it out. When he turned to me, I ran into his arms without hesitation. He held me tightly, one hand at the back of my head as if checking whether I was truly unharmed. "You made it in time," I whispered, my voice breaking. "Always," he said, and then he led me out of the corridor and back toward the ballroom where every eye began to turn toward us. Graham stopped in the center of the room and took my hand. Conversations died. The music had stopped without anyone noticing. A single overhead light fell directly on us as though we were standing on a stage. Graham looked toward Victor, then toward Carmela, then at the murmuring crowd. His voice rose, clear and unwavering, without the help of a microphone. "She is not just my fiancée, she is mine." I felt the weight of every stare, the whispers, the raised brows, the startled expressions. But there was no fear anymore, because I knew I was no longer the shadow behind a facade. I was myself, standing beside a man who did not hide me as a tool, but placed me at the center of his life, openly, without hesitation, without concealment. The air in the ballroom froze after Graham's declaration. I could feel every gaze fixed on us, each carrying its own blend of surprise, suspicion, calculation, or admiration. But in that suspended moment, Graham did not look at anyone but me. His hand tightened around mine, affirming once more that I was here not because of an arrangement, not because of a role, but because of something we had both chosen. I looked into his eyes and saw something transformed. The calculation was gone. The guardedness was gone. What remained was sincerity, uncovered and steady. He turned back to the crowd, his voice low but resonating through the stillness. His words echoed inside me like a vow. I saw Carmela lift one eyebrow, not in disapproval, but as though she was measuring the weight of what he had proclaimed. Victor stood frozen on the ballroom floor, the familiar half-smile erased completely. And I, in the middle of it all, stood without trembling, without shrinking. In a life where I had grown used to being hidden, used as a means, chosen for convenience or advantage, this was the first time I had been chosen simply for who I was, not to lure, not to bargain, but to protect, to love, to stand in the light as an equal. Graham leaned down, whispering so only I could hear. "If you walk away right now, I will not regret saying any of that. But if you stay, then from this moment on, no one touches you but me." I lifted my eyes to his, and I knew that whatever came after this night, there was no returning to what we were, because we had stepped out of the game, and chosen each other, not with words alone, but with trust. 3 days after the gala, everything seemed to slow in an almost eerie way. The mansion was no longer bustling. No more hurried footsteps, no more guests, no more preparations. Only the steady ticking of an old clock and the soft footsteps of a few cleaning staff echoed through the halls. I sat alone in the upstairs sitting room, where the late autumn light poured through the windows, illuminating the armchair where I curled up. On the table before me lay a thick envelope, its golden paper embossed with the Bennett crest. Inside was the final contract Graham had given me that morning. It was no longer a proposal, no longer an obligation. Only a choice. A full hospital payment for my mother's treatment, and a sum of money enough for us to begin again anywhere I wanted, in any state I chose. No tracking necklace, no clauses, only freedom. I had everything I once wished for. My mother healed, our debts erased, and a future that stretched open like a field without fences. I could leave now, without resistance, but I could not stand. I stared at the empty signature line and realized my hands were not shaking out of fear, but uncertainty. Graham had kept his word. Since the gala, he had not called me his fiancée. He had not touched me unless I reached for him first. He gave me space to think. He even moved out of the master bedroom, and never once came to mine. But I recognized every footstep of his passing by my door. I felt every glance we exchanged during quiet meals. There was something between us that no contract could sever, though he had handed me the key to cut it loose. I remembered the nights he sat beside my mother's hospital bed reading to her, his voice calm and steady, as though he were not the man who made half of Philadelphia wary. I remembered the look in his eyes when he placed the necklace in my hand, not as a claim, but as a quiet promise. He would always know where I was, not to hold me, but to keep me safe. I remembered our first kiss, the warm golden light on his hair, and the faint tremor in his hand when I leaned into him. I could leave, but where would I hide all of that? I could start over, but would anyone else ever look at me the way he had, when I was nothing except a girl falling through the cracks of her own life? I closed my eyes, breathing deeply, and finally lowered the pen. But not onto the line of agreement. I folded the paper, slipped it into the envelope, and walked out of the room, straight down the stairs where Graham was speaking with Carmela. When he saw me, he stopped. He did not rush, he did not reach for me, he simply waited. I stepped toward him, the envelope in my hand, and held it out. He looked at me, and for the first time his eyes did not hide their worry. "I'm not signing," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "Because I'm not staying for the money. I just need to know. If you mean what you said." Graham did not answer immediately. He looked at me for a long moment, then slowly reached out and took my hand. "If you stay," he said softly, "I will never let you doubt that again." I tightened my fingers around his, my heartbeat, finally slowing. No longer frantic, no longer uncertain. For the first time, I was not choosing out of necessity. I was choosing because I wanted to. On a late autumn afternoon, sunlight fell softly across the tiled roof of the Bennett estate, and the maple leaves drifting onto the stone steps felt as quiet and deliberate as the thoughts I had finally sorted through. I returned to the same grand door I had walked out of a few days earlier, carrying no suitcase, no luggage, only a heart that finally understood where home truly was. Graham stood at the top of the steps, silent, as though he had been waiting there for a long time. He did not ask why I came back, did not request an explanation. He simply looked at me with gentle eyes, and I knew that this time nothing between us was pretend. I walked toward him and reached for his hand first. In that moment, every wound, every doubt, every worn-out memory lost its weight. We had not begun in perfection, but it was the scars that taught us the value of each other. I did not return because I needed someone to lean on, but because I knew I had chosen the right person to walk beside. During my time with Graham, I learned that real love is not something flawless or polished to please others. It is the moment you see someone at their worst and still feel the desire to stay. It is when you carry your own hurt and still find the courage to open your heart once more. It is choosing to remain not because you fear loneliness, but because you believe that together you can become something better. Life always places us at difficult crossroads. And Victor? I heard he had been transferred to manage a branch in Europe. A promotion, everyone understood, was simply a polite way to remove him from Graham's sphere. Sometimes what is right is not what is easy, and what is easy does not always lead us to happiness. But when you truly listen to your heart, you know which road you are meant to follow. Looking back on the journey, from a diner waitress to standing beside a man who once made an entire city wary, I feel no regret, because every sacrifice eventually led me back to the place where I truly belonged. If you are following this story, perhaps you too have stood at crossroads like mine. Perhaps you have loved the wrong person, been wounded, or believed you were unworthy of real affection. But trust me, there is always someone waiting at the end of the road, someone who will love you not because you are perfect, but because you are simply yourself. What do you think of this story? Do you believe that even in the midst of heartbreak, real love can still grow? Leave a comment below and share your feelings with us. We always want to hear the stories that come from the deepest part of your heart. If this story touched something within you, do not forget to like the video, share it with those you love, and especially subscribe to our channel so you will not miss the emotional and meaningful stories we share each day. We hope each video offers you a new perspective, a moment of stillness in the rush of life, and perhaps even a small spark of hope to keep believing in good things. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this story. Wishing you good health, a life filled with daily joy and peace. We look forward to seeing you in the next video. Goodbye.